All right, welcome everybody to the December Pathways to Adult Success Solution Forum. Today we're going to be talking about meeting the high school graduation and post-secondary success challenge for students with disabilities. I'm going to begin with a short presentation from our most recent Building the Grad Nation report, and then we're going to turn it over to our friends Lindsay and Joey from the National Center for Learning Disabilities to talk about high school graduation and post-secondary success challenge for students with disabilities. Along the way, we encourage you to share your ideas and your questions in the chat, and we'll be pausing for Q&A after both my presentation, in the middle of their presentation, at the end again. We'll then have an open discussion and resource sharing, and finish with some upcoming events. Next slide. We have, as always, we have a diverse group of folks representing both K-12 and higher ed and nonprofits, state departments of education. Please share your ideas and resources and ask questions with the chat function. We'll read out the questions during the Q&A, and also please feel free to share things, and we'll either directly to us or to everybody, and we'll share them. And after the session, we'll be taping it. We'll be sending out all the resources and other things that were shared during the presentation today. Next slide. So this is all part of our Building Pathways to Adult Success. All of this work we're doing is within this framework of how do we build pathways to adult success. And it's really this idea that's combining both close monitoring, progress monitoring of all students on key indicators, making sure all students have good guidance and navigation supports to figure out where to go after high school, improving the connections between higher ed and the workforce and K-12, and finding a way to have right. I got muted for a second, but I'm back. And how data needs to be shared across all those domains. And really what we're going to get into today is nowhere is that more essential than for students when students with disabilities, right? That's really, it is crucial for all, but in particular for students with disabilities, all of these elements are crucial, and we're going to get into that today. So next slide. So when we were looking at our annual Building Grad Nation report this year, and we were trying to look out what was starting to differentiate states or what challenges were they facing as we're getting closer as a nation to 90% on-time graduation, where are the remaining challenges? And one thing that really stood out was this question of are we leaving students with disabilities behind in our improvement efforts over the past 20 years? And there's some pretty, challenging statistics here, right, which indicate, unfortunately, perhaps we are. So the pre-pandemic high school graduation rate for students with disabilities was only 68%. And that, unfortunately, is probably even an overestimate, because we know there are still some challenges with how individual states report their graduation rates for students with disabilities. And even though there's clear federal guidance on that, there is still some state variation, with some states still counting things different or in addition to a regular 4-year diploma as graduation for students with disabilities. Students with disabilities now are the lowest of all subgroups, and they're a full 18 points behind the national average for all students. There's been some progress. It's gone up. If the extent that the data is trustworthy, it's gone up about 6 points over the past 7 or 8 years. But at that pace, right, we're less than a point a year. It's 20 years from now to get to the national average at that rate of growth, right, which would really indicate we are leaving them behind. Because of this, students with disabilities represent only about 12% of all high school students. Some of this is because there's fewer of them may be identified or choose to be identified in high school, but in elementary or middle school. But they represent 27% of the students who do not graduate in 4 years, right? So you can see a very big disparity there between percent of all and percent of all non-graduates. Pre-pandemic, almost a third of high school students with disabilities were chronically absent, compared to about 23% of all students. We already can see that not only are they not graduating, but they are really struggling to sort of be engaged and participate in high school in general. One reason for this is they are being disciplined, getting suspended at a much higher rate. So secondary school students with disabilities miss 2 times as many instructional days due to out-of-school suspension than students without disabilities. So you see a fairly sort of stark picture there, right, of only relatively low success rates at actually earning or getting diplomas. When we know from the research that nearly all students with disabilities with the right supports and experiences and opportunities can graduate with a regular diploma. So a big gap there between potential and reality. And we can see already high signs of both disengagement from schooling or feeling that schooling is high school is not for them. And high school is in a way actively pushing them away, right, by these high levels of suspension. Altogether, a pretty strong case to say that, yeah, we're leaving them behind. Next slide. And when we look at a state level, we can see this even a more dramatic relief. So when we look at this idea of where are the remaining non-grads in states, we see in a good number of states, those in purple and in sort of dark blue, that more than 30% of the non-graduates are students with disabilities. And in those purple states, it's 40% of non-graduates are students with disabilities. Some of these are states with relatively high graduation rates, right? In the Northeast there, right? The sort of New England states have high graduation rates, which means almost all of the remaining students who are not graduating are students with disabilities. Next slide. And, sometimes national or state data can tell a lot. Sometimes it leaves the picture a little blurred. So I really wanted to take a minute. This is data from a state and a subset of districts within a state where they have really good data. And because they have really good data, I thought I would not penalize them for that by calling them out because they're just illustrative of other states. They just happen to have the data to show it. And we can see here, these are a range of high poverty districts within that state where most of the students are classified as students, free lunch students. And we can see, pretty high percentage of kids are being identified as students with disabilities in these districts. I mean, all the way up to a quarter of the kids in 3 of them. We can see again, their grad rates are at the national level or below, right? In a number of cases, they're in the 40s. And then we look at, how do you get to a low grad rate? Well, you struggle to pass your 9th grade classes. And again, we can see in most of the districts, well less than half of the kids, well, except for in 2 of them, it's 2/3 of the kids are passing the classes. But in all the others, half or less are passing all of their 9th grade classes, which means, essentially half or more are off track from 9th grade forward. And then we can see what is their access to advanced courses, right? Which are about not only do we need to graduate everybody, we got to graduate them ready for post-secondary. We're going to hear quite a bit about how we can do that in a minute. And again, here we can see some variation, right? Which again shows you that better outcomes are possible. In 2 of the districts, at least 40% of the students with disabilities were completing advanced courses. And these are things like AP classes, IB classes, dual credit classes. But we can see in some other districts, it's single digits of these kids, right? And again, this is showing you that so much of this is about sort of school and district level organization, right? As opposed to the inherent abilities of the students themselves. Next slide. So the last thing I want to do, last question I want to throw out there when we say, are we leaving students with disabilities behind, is how could that be happening? We have IDA, don't we? Right? Why isn't IDA enough to have different outcomes than we're seeing, right? On one hand, students with disabilities are the only subgroup that have sort of an independent funding stream and at some level, the right of parents to sort of seek grievances against the district in the courts if they don't feel their kids are getting the services they're entitled. But even with those advantages, right, we don't see the outcomes we might hope for. So a couple ideas to throw out there for us to debate and consider and think through is that one, when you think about IDA and sort of from them, the main thing, IEPs, right, that every individual education plans that every student gets and is sort of the center of special education services. historically have not focused on things like attendance, belonging, or post-secondary pathways, right? They've been very instructionally and behaviorally oriented. And because of that, we saw those chronic absenteeism rates. Those aren't necessarily like being, triggered in IEPs all the time, right? Because that's just, historically it wasn't the way. And then the other thing we notice, right, we know that from the pandemic and everything, the sense of belonging, right? Do I really belong here? Am I accepted for who I am, right? We know that's critical to all student success and beyond, and intensified in a way for students with disabilities, because they often feel I don't belong because of my disability. And again, those key elements perhaps are not being paid attention to within those traditional IEPs. And then the challenge is that much of the school believes the IEP has it covered, right? Right? We don't, those kids, they got their IEPs, and maybe we'll get in trouble if we sort of do some stuff and aren't aware of those IEPs. So for example, it's often the case that students with disabilities historically, and still in many cases contemporaneously, are not included in other systems of student support. Things like early warning and on-track systems, right? Because the thought is the IEP's got it covered, even as we see the IEP doesn't pay attention necessarily to a lot of critical things. And then finally, just within that is this point we brought up at the beginning, that there are many inconsistencies still in how states calculate high school graduation rates, particularly what type of diplomas count. And so again, we can sometimes get a false positive about progress being made because different states are sort of counting it in different ways. So I'll pause there and ask if there are any questions or comments or things people want to share in the chat, or anybody want to disprove my thesis.
I'd love. My name's Matthew. I'd love to share. I just put a comment in the chat.
Please go ahead.
So I mean, just to keep up with the acronyms and keep things consistent. I am a former HSSWD. So I had an IEP in high school. And my experience was my IEP was totally behaviorally oriented. And I can tell you that I don't have behavioral challenges. I'm not, but the special education department at my high school was razor focused on behavior. We got to focus on your behavior, Matt. You're too impulsive. You get too excited about things. You get like, your behavior is a problem.
Right. So
that was a complete horrible, just a terrible experience.
Thank you for sharing and really giving a human element to the idea that this belief the IEP has it covered. It could be wrong in so many ways. The IEP itself can be wrong, and then the things it doesn't cover, the things that you actually need support in, that you're perhaps not getting the support because people figure, well, we got it covered.
Amy also commented that she agreed with all of your points, Bob.
Okay. Okay, I see that Linda Litzinger raised her hand. Linda, do you want to jump in here?
We live in a state that educates 1/10 of all students in the US because it's so big. And there was actually a law passed by the legislature that all of your grades had to be out of the regular ed curriculum in order to pass high school, and they did not have an exception for PE. And so if you were in a wheelchair, you weren't going to get a diploma. And we're talking about kids that had 8 APs and had already been accepted into college, and we're not going to be able to get a diploma. So we need to maybe even look toward our legislatures to do the right thing sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. It's very true, right? We know that some of the real issues we face are based in state legislation, and also just the broader idea that it's people very, very far away from the lived reality, sort of making the regulations, right? and not really understanding what it is on the ground, and what's needed to enable all kids, and in this case, students with disabilities, to succeed in high school and and be ready for post-secondary success. All right. Any other questions?
Still on the theme of sort of a one-note focus. I think it's Amy says, I was fine academically with physical supports, so I received little social supports. So once again, just too narrow a focus.
Yeah, and that's Amy Lutzinger, so same experience as Linda Lutzinger. So,
thank you so much.
Same state, same school district, if that helps.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Amy. All right, well, we're gonna have opportunities to continue this discussion, but right now I'd like to turn it over to our friends from the National Center for Learning Disabilities.
Great.
Joey and Lindsay, take it away.
Great. Hi, thank you so much. I'll let Lindsay introduce himself, and then I'll introduce myself and give a little bit of a background about Ncld and get into our presentation. So Lindsay, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Joey. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Kobatsky. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at National Center for Learning Disabilities, and excited to share with you some of our findings from some of our focus groups and other projects that we've been working on, and excited to share this opportunity with you all.
Great. And I'm Joey Hunziker. I'm the Director of our Young Adult Initiatives. So I get the great honor of working with young adults with learning disabilities who are current and future leaders in the disability rights movement. Just a little bit of a background about Ncld. We're a national advocacy and policy organization focused on learning disabilities. So those are brain-based disabilities that impact how students learn. So things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, we cover ADHD, auditory processing disorder, but are also situated within the broader disability coalition and focus on other issues related to education and civil rights. So just a little bit of a background on that. So some of the discussion today will be focused on specifically feedback from young adults with learning disabilities. And then the later section, we hear from people with disabilities across the spectrum. So today, we hope to explore findings from several different focus groups that we've conducted over the past few years. Lindsay will go into some implications for policy, and I had hoped to bring one of our young adult leaders who spoke on the last presentation of the Grad Nation report, but they were both very busy today. So we're not able to bring them, but because I think in keeping with the disability rights community motto, nothing about us without us. So I always hope to bring young people to meetings and conversations like this, but unfortunately we were not able to. All right, so I'll jump in. Next slide, please. So we're in particular interested in transition for young people with learning disabilities because we know that there are a huge host of issues in that transition from high school to the workforce, to college, to the military, any number of post-secondary pathways that students with disabilities pursue. There's a lot of hurdles there. A lack of access to quality information is one of the biggest ones that we'll explore today, as well as navigating the difficult process of disclosing your disability and securing accommodations in college or in the workplace. So we're in particular really interested in that because we know that high school has a huge impact on what happens to students after high school. So next slide. Here's just a couple of three key issues that we sort of think about: disclosure, accommodations, and then outcomes. And these are three areas that we see opportunities to both explore more and for there to be policy action to improve. There's a couple of quick facts. I won't go through all of them, but one big one to look at is that 1 in 4 students with a learning disability disclose their disability in college. That's very tiny. We know that when the legal precedent switches from the school district being required to find and identify students with disabilities to the onus being on a student to disclose and seek accommodations, there's this massive gap between their ability to get accommodations and support. And that's a huge issue between the high school and post-secondary system. As you'll see, that leads to huge drops in the number of students who are getting accommodations. So in high school, 94% of students with a learning disability received accommodations, but only 17% received accommodations in their post-secondary education. And then the big thing that we're thinking about is the outcomes for students with learning disabilities. And this is where things are a little more difficult because the data collection post-high school doesn't separate between types of disability. Oftentimes they're all coupled together, and our data systems there are a little inconsistent, but only 38% of young adults with disabilities complete some form of post-secondary education, which is compared to 51.2% of non-disabled students. So those are just ways to frame it that we like to think through. You can go to the next slide. So we've done a lot of work to understand the experiences of young adults with learning disabilities so that we can better understand what policy actions can be taken and how legislators can think about these issues to address them. So in 2019, we partnered with understood.org to conduct focus groups with young adults across the country about their experience transitioning out of high school. Next slide. The goal of these focus groups was to understand what do young adults need in terms of resources and tools to help them transition out of high school and into college and life. This was an important question for us because A, our work around young adults was nascent, and B, we thought there were a lot of implications for what researchers and the general public as well as Congress could learn from some of these focus groups. So next slide. Here's some key themes. I won't go through all of them, but overwhelmingly, young adults in these focus groups identified that there's a huge lack of resources available to them to help them understand where they can go to school, what are some of the options that they have once they leave high school, how can they get assistance to help them with their goals that they want to achieve. I think it was Matthew who mentioned that much of the things that were included on his IEP were behaviorally focused and nothing about his intended goals. And that was a real key theme that we learned from these focus groups. Another thing that we heard from young adults in these focus groups was they wanted to have their teachers, their bosses, and their school counselors receive more training on how to work with people with learning disabilities, because that could both assist them in setting strong goals for after high school, as well as accomplishing those goals throughout high school. A big thing we saw was that young adults lacked knowledge of what their rights were, and that they that's a huge gap that I mentioned before between high school and college. In high school, they are protected under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in college, that legal protection drastically shifts. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a really foundational and important civil rights law, but it puts a lot of the onus on students to do the research to figure out, does my school have a disability service center? What accommodations and supports are available to me, and then actually having to fight for those rights, because sometimes they are not given access to accommodations, or as we found, they're asked to get a new psychometric evaluation to prove that they have a disability. Next slide, please. Another key thing that we heard from young adults in these focus groups was fear that if they were to ask for accommodations, they would either face stigma or exclusion, and that it actually wouldn't be able to assist them with achieving any goals after high school. And then a lot of young adults expressed that they lacked knowledge about what resources were already available to them, and they didn't want to use those resources because it would call attention to the fact that they had this disability, and it might lead to even more stigma and more exclusion. So we share these as an important set of information from young adult perspectives, because I think there's a lot of key connections here to your work on college, high school graduation, and understanding where young adults are coming from and what are they thinking through as they're going from the high school setting to something after high school. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of lack of knowledge that students have, and then wanting real dedicated support to assist them was something that we heard quite a bit. I'm happy to talk more about those focus groups and where we did them and things like that at the end. I know I didn't cover any of that at all, but I'll move on to our next slide. One of the big things that we heard from young adults throughout those initial focus groups, we actually posed a couple of solutions to them, like what would you like to see changed and what would help you in that transition process. And they identified two key imaginary resources. One was a college compass and one was a career compass. If you go to the next slide. So specifically, they wanted a specialized tool to help them navigate their post-high school career and college choices and give them tailored resources based on their interests and their goals. It's important because they identified that there were a lack of resources and tailored directly to their needs. A lot of things were very generalized, nothing specific to them, and that support really dropped off after high school. So that's something as a key takeaway from that set of focus groups. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk about a set of focus groups that we just conducted this year, really focused on IEPs and the experience of students in special education programming in high school. So if you could go to the next slide. We have been working this year with the American Institutes of Research in a federally funded project called the Progress Center. We conducted focus groups with parents and young adults to understand their experience about the creation and implementation of their IEP and their IEP transitions after high school. So if you go to the next slide. So I'm just going to cover this very briefly. We asked parents and students a set of questions. We did it a sort of a mixed approach. We did a public poll via Zoom and then sort of detailed question and answer section during the focus group, which were all conducted virtually. I think the key takeaways from here are, young adults and parents were pretty split on some of these questions and their experiences. Young adults felt like teachers, principals, and other staff had high expectations for them and really valued them. And they really valued having an IEP. It was such a critical thing that many young adults referenced, that having an IEP was so important to their success. Similarly, they expressed that they weren't included in the development of those IEPs and those IEP goals. And they didn't have necessarily a ton of negative feelings about that, but we heard from them that, like, if you want to make any progress at in supporting students with disabilities in achieving their IEP goals, you have to include them. That it can't just be the student was invited and they sat there the whole time, but that they were actively involved in setting the goals and metrics of their IEP. If you could go to the next slide, here's just some of the key themes, as I mentioned. One other thing that we heard from young adults that wasn't shown on that last slide was that they really valued early identification and early supports because it sets them on a pathway to success in high school and in the graduation and transition process. These focus groups dealt with students of all disabilities, and we heard overwhelmingly that the earlier they were identified, the earlier they got into a support system and received accommodations that helped them develop strategies and skills to work with their disability, and how critical that was, and something that they wanted more students to have access to was early screening and early identification. If you could go to the next slide. Happy to take questions on any of the focus groups. I know I just ran through quite a bit, so I'll pause and take some questions.
We have a question from Linda in the chat. We have 24 programs, college experiences across our state. A few support students to gain a regular degree, but most offer specialized certificates in a skill. What is your opinion about colleges offering special programs versus pulling out all stops toward a regular degree?
So Linda, would you mind elaborating a little bit more of like what some of those special programs are? Are they aligned to like career pathways, or are they sort of lower tracked programs for students with disabilities?
Two of them train people to become personal attendants and then either work in a nursing home or for an individual in their own home. They tend to never really get to their own home because of transportation, and they're not able to drive the client anywhere. I'm trying to think of some of the others. They're individual skills to get a certain kind of job, and they're very narrow and pretty easy to learn, I would say. They do give a college experience. You get to live in a dorm and so forth. And some of them offer work during the time you're there. You're trying a few jobs out.
Yeah, great. I would say as an organization, we wouldn't necessarily have opinions on like what a particular state is doing. We think that if states are addressing the needs of students and creating programs based off their needs, then that's appropriate. Listening to what students with disabilities need and what they want as career pathways is really critical and important. I'd say tracking systems we know have existed for years, and they have tracked students with disabilities into lower wage or lower skill positions. We don't see that typically with a lot of students with learning disabilities. That often is other disability types. But I would say that programs that are aligned to what students want have a much higher chance of success. And we know that students both deserve support in colleges and universities, that's the sort of legal requirement, as well as these students can deliver, they can succeed. And so you shouldn't have lower expectations for them based off of their disability status.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Yulia. There was a point on the slides regarding challenges with a formal diagnosis. Can you elaborate on that? It sounds as though students may not be aware of the specifics of their needs, suggesting that the IEP may not have been specific enough or had valuable assessments.
Yes, and I'll let Lindsay chime in after this too, but so we know getting an IEP is actually quite a process for many students. It intersects with language and race and ability, and so the way in which IEPs are written varies. There's not a huge consistent standard for how IEPs are developed. Legally, there are requirements for that, but what an IEP looks like varies. I run our scholarship program, and so we collect IEPs from all across the country, and I have seen so many vastly different IEP types. And so there are many students who don't actually know what their disability might be. They just know they have an IEP. or they may be categorized under an umbrella term like a specific learning disability or other health impairment, and they're not given necessarily like the name of dyslexia or dyscalculia. And in addition to that, there may not be specifics that there are, resources and goals set directly to what their diagnosis was. So yeah, I think there's a lot of variability on that front with IEPs. And then I'm going to let Lindsay chime in and see if he wants to add anything.
Yeah, Yulia, I think you make a great point about IEPs may not be specific enough for students once they to have a good understanding of what they need after high school. And so that's what we see a lot when students go to college and they bring their IEP to the Disability Services Office. Oftentimes those Disability Services offices won't accept that as proof of a disability, in large part because of that variability and that it doesn't have sometimes it doesn't have a specific diagnosis within that the disability services offices can go off of to begin to provide accommodations. And so we see that as an issue across the country. So one thing that we've advocated for is more specificity within that IEP process, in addition to having more have students have more agency and ownership over the IEP process and what's in it and the types of services provided, but also that those IEPs should be helpful to the student once they graduate from college and begin their life after high school.
Thanks, Lindsay. There's a quick follow-up and then we'll move to Matthew. Yulia adds, do you have resources for schools on how to pinpoint specifics within the LD classification?
Specific interventions or supports that students should receive according to their LD? That
I think
I'm thinking of assessments, like it's so hard to think about assessments. I don't know, but just a starting point we can guide schools, because I'm seeing that same pattern.
Resources to help schools provide useful assessments and diagnoses, I think.
Yeah, Yulia, I think I can follow up with some of our resources around SLD identification and eligibility, and sort of the ways in which we recommend school psychologists. And this was a lot of these resources were done in collaboration with school psychologists. And so I think if I understand your question correctly, I think I can provide some of those resources that talk about ways in which the evaluation process and the progress monitoring process and the assessment piece all fits in together to where we're not misidentifying students with disabilities or students without disabilities, and that we're making the correct diagnosis given what Joey talked about, where a lot of these students come with intersectional identities, such as being a student impacted by poverty or English learner and things like that. So we want to be able to identify a student accurately so we can get the interventions that they need tailored to their abilities and needs.
And Lindsay, if you share those with us too, we'll share them out with everybody in our follow-ups. I see that Matthew is just trying to jump in here before we move on.
Yeah, so this is sort of a big question. So I'm not expecting any sort of consensus on anything, but my college experience, I graduated 3 years ago. I'm currently in grad school, but my undergrad experience with the Disability Services Office was only about accommodations. It wasn't about skill development or advocacy, or it wasn't about meeting up and sharing and students becoming friends with each other. It was solely accommodation focused. So my question is, this was my experience. Someone else's experience could be completely different, but do you think that there needs to be some sort of reimagining of how disability services offices function in addition to their legally required and mandated functions?
So a great question. I have a couple things. So one, disability services centers vary from college to college. There's no federal funding stream for them. They're usually a set aside that a college or university uses their own funds for. So we see many colleges and universities just don't even have one. But there has been, and related to that, who staffs those centers varies. There's other organizations working in the university space, I think of AHEAD and others, who have done a lot of great work to reform what disability service centers are doing, to professionalize them in a way. Oftentimes people who work in disability service centers are either part-time or half-time FTE. They may be people who are used to working in student services, but don't necessarily understand what students with disabilities need for accommodations and support. And then recently, there's been a big discussion about the difference between a disability service center and a disability cultural center. Like you mentioned, of being able to connect students with disabilities to find support and resources. I read this article, and I'll find it and share it with the team to share out with everyone, that spoke about that need that students, like just giving a student an accommodation helps them to an extent, right? But being able to network with others to understand what that community looks like is one of the value propositions of higher ed, to be able to create community where you wouldn't necessarily have community already. And so you bring up a really interesting point that, like, oftentimes disability service centers are the liaison between faculty and students around the accommodations process. And there's lots of efforts to fix that, but at the same time, what else do students with disabilities need to be successful, knowing that all those other wraparound and cultural factors impact their ability to succeed in college. So yeah, great points.
Yeah,
Joy, I think that often starts earlier. Like we can have a better understanding of that earlier. To Bob's point about, like, in high school, one thing that we've been advocating for is within these IEP transition documents and things like that, it's to, like, what does this college do for students with disabilities? What types of services do they provide? What kind of culture do students with disabilities have on campus that might be a good fit for each student? And so I think if we start that process earlier and start thinking about the transition process to after high school, it can create a better system once students graduate from high school.
And just to build on that and give a transition to Lindsay is going to take us home with some policy considerations, is that we know in a lot of the work we're doing in Pathways to Adult Success that just in general, there is a lack of communication between K-12 and higher ed, partly because historically it used to be most kids ended their formal public schooling after high school, and therefore there wasn't necessarily a need to have that thing. But now when everyone has to have some sort of post-secondary schooling or training to get a family supporting wage, it's really necessary for the K-12 and the higher ed to be in tight communication. They just haven't built those muscles up yet. And we can see with this IEP is just another glaring example that, you could almost see it should be a requirement of high schools to have a final IEP that's a bridging IEP to college or training that's really future oriented, that can be interpreted by people at the next place the kid is going, is how do we keep providing, consistency of supports and the right supports. But right now, just because of the way it's historically done, once a kid graduates high school, the school is done with them, right? Their job is done, and they're not really invested in that transition success. And it's a general challenge, but I think this is really calling out also a specific challenge for students with learning disabilities. With that, I want to turn it over to Lindsay to give us a few insights into some policy considerations for this work.
Yeah, thank you. So as Joey mentioned, Ncld is primarily a policy and advocacy organization at the federal level. And so all of our programming or our policy influences our programming and vice versa. And so these focus groups help us to advocate on the Hill and with the Department of Education on and other agencies on different things that we think can support students with disabilities, and in particular students with learning disabilities. So I'll talk a bit about just a few of the policy implications and efforts that we are engaging with at the federal level. So the first one is we advocate for Congress to increase funding for research. And we're advocating specifically for Congress to increase funding for research on effective transition planning and strategies for students with disabilities, and that those strategies are developmentally and culturally applicable and beneficial for students with disabilities, and that these transition strategies include self-advocacy skills. So we've talked a lot about how the legal system sort of changes for students with disabilities once they enter the workforce or college. And so it's primarily on the student to get those accommodations and to advocate for themselves to receive those. And so we are asking Congress to provide additional funding so we have a better understanding of how we can teach those self-advocacy skills. And we are advocating for increased funding to help students, like for research on how to transition students from post-secondary education into the workforce as well. So that's one policy implication that we're advocating for, or one policy recommendation that we're advocating for here in Washington, DC. The second one is, it's a pretty specific one, and we are asking the Department of Education to issue guidance around providing accommodations for testing company, for organizations that administer different types of tests, such as college entrance exams, the AP test, licensure exam, certification tests, things like that. So we are advocating for the department to be clear on the types of accommodations that students with disabilities need and deserve when they take some of those assessments. In addition, we are advocating that that data isn't shared with post-secondary institutions unless a student wants that information to be shared. So if you do receive accommodations on some of these things, we advocate that that is up to the student to provide that information to whether it's the college or the workplace if they receive those accommodations. Again, because unfortunately there is a stigma around having a disability and what actually accommodations mean and do for students with disabilities. The next policy recommendation that we have is for the Department of Education. They have a research arm, and one thing that we would like for them to do is prioritize research that conducts longitudinal research on the experiences of students with disabilities from high school through post-secondary education. And so in this way, we are able to see what effective transition strategies occurred during that time, what some of the interventions are, what some of the barriers to college access, persistence, and completion are, and ways in which we can help students with disabilities going from high school to college to the workforce. And again, we want to make sure that that is responsive to the intersectional identities of these different students. So making sure that those interventions are culturally, linguistically, and otherwise effective for different groups of students. The fourth policy recommendation that we have is to incorporate, for the Department of Education to incorporate stronger transition plans within some of their state performance plans and annual performance reports that states are required to do. So we are recommending that the Department of Education specify that transition teams, so students with disabilities do need to have transition teams and do need to have IEPs that talk about what occurs after high school, that those transition teams include information in an IEP that contain adequate information on how to secure accommodations in college or the workforce, and that it assists students with disabilities in contacting the Disability Services Office on college campuses before they graduate high school. So not when they get to high school and then they're a couple weeks into class and like they have their first assessment or final or midterm or something like that, and they realize they don't have any sort of accommodations that they're used to getting. So we want to make sure that students with disabilities have that information before they ever step foot on college campuses. And finally, we want to So this is a little different than the first four, but we want to work with the Department of Education to make sure that they invest in comprehensive data collection on disability in the workforce. So as Joey was mentioning, a lot of the data that we collect isn't disaggregated by disability type. So it's really difficult to see the experiences of different individuals within the workforce based on their type of disability. So what's working for individuals with autism may not work for individuals with learning disabilities, and may not work for individuals with other types of disabilities. So we need a robust data system to where we can understand what's working and not working for different groups of students or groups of individuals, and that's disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So we have a good understanding of what's happening in the workforce and what's working and not working and for whom. And so that's sort of the 5 policy recommendations based off of the focus groups that we've been conducting and talking with other stakeholders, including people like Dr. Balfanz and others, on ways in which we can improve this process. So when students are in high school, they're able to have a pathway to success after they graduate. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Amanda, if you can just go one more slide forward, we can bring it to the one more. Yeah, so nope, the one back. So what we want to do now in our last minutes here is really have an open discussion and resource sharing. There's a lot of knowledgeable people on the call today that have been sharing some great ideas. So I really want to open it up both to questions to Lindsay and Joey on their presentations, but also just more broadly, to put all our students, including students with disabilities, on a pathway to adult success. What do we need to do? What ideas are out there? What are some things that are working or we need to think about, or things we need to change? Now's really the time for folks to share what they know and think on this. And we'll pass it back out to everybody who both was able to attend today, and then we have a large number of people that participate by watching the recordings of this. So we'll share with them as well. As folks are thinking about that and gathering what their ideas or resources or questions, I'm going to lead off with one question for Joey on the focus group results. On for some of the students seem perhaps surprisingly positive, and I was just wondering how that juxtaposed with the third that aren't graduating and the third that are chronically absent, and whether we think maybe they weren't in the focus group, or is it that the kids are differentiating? They like their teachers, but at school they have a problem with. I'm just,
Yeah, I think you touched on 2 things. One, we did not have a fully representative sample, right? We worked with parent and other organizations across the country to identify youth and young adults, and got representation from multiple disability types, but everyone had graduated. So we didn't have students who had not graduated.
Gotcha, okay.
But I think the other thing you touched on is students generally had positive experiences with schools and IEPs, but there was a big disconnect between what they wanted and what was actually being provided to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think parents were way more forthright with us that they did not like what their students were receiving. I didn't put it in the presentation, but parents were overwhelmingly negative about both the quality of programming as well as the experiences they had with developing the IEP. And I'd say what we saw from young adults was that they were still sort of struggling and figuring things out. And so they didn't necessarily place the blame on that on their high schools, but sort of the experience of being a young adult in a world today that is really volatile and unfriendly to this generation.
Yeah, and unfortunately, right, they all of us tend to internalize still, right? It's like,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
And do we have any questions or comments or things in the chat to respond to?
Yeah, Linda suggested a while ago, she said, we see that high schools aren't into updating evaluations in the senior year, so that students get to college and are asked to obtain a neuropsych evaluation, which is costly. high schools need to step up to the plate. And she has also offered to send us for subsequent distribution the link to a new interactive app which Texas has developed for students age 14 and up to get them ready for higher education. So thank you, Linda. You are a gold mine of information. It's
And
wonderful.
may I add one more thing, because I have to leave for a meeting? It's a positive. My daughter was an English major. She's on here, took teaching of writing and worked in the writing center, helping all students polish their papers. And the students with disabilities felt more comfortable going to her and lined up and waited for her. I guess it was less embarrassing. She had them start by reading their papers aloud while they held her service dog. So maybe colleges can get a little creative in how they support their students. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And you know, that app seems like an example of the compass, right? That the kids were asking for.
Yes, thank you very much for offering this today.
Thank you. All right. Any final comments or questions for the good of the order?
Taylor has suggested that the data disaggregation that Lindsay proposes include disaggregation on urban versus rural. And Lindsay has, accepted, endorsed that suggestion. So that's all I got.
Thank you. All right, this conversation obviously needs to continue, and I want to thank folks for a very rich conversation. I just want to leave us with a few announcements or other things to follow up on. That one of our Pathways to Adult Success members, Tina Fernandez from Achieve Atlanta, recently has an op-ed in the Atlanta Constitution on the pandemic's impacts on kids going to college, which we didn't even add to our mix today, right? How the pandemic is further complicated things for students with disabilities. Myself and a colleague have recently put out a new book on continuous improvement on helping more high schools succeed, for those who want to check it out. And the newsletter for Pathways to Adult Success recently featured an innovative program from the university near Chicago, and really around career education. And there's a new grants opportunity from Gates in that newsletter as well. So folks should check that out. And we want to remind everybody we'll be back for the next chapter of the Pathways to Adult Success Solution Forums at the end of January. And in the meantime, we wish everybody a happy holidays and hope people can find a little bit of time to rest and recharge. And I want to thank everybody for the work they've been doing to help students find and stay in a pathway to adult success. And with that, we say thank you, be well, and onward.